Well, students, hello and welcome. This is our second detour, second lecture on Locke, and we shall resume from the point where we had left in our previous lecture. You remember that we had emphasized on the notion of law or the role of civil magistrate or the judges, which Locke had emphasized. And as I told you, this is precisely the point where Locke is very different from Hobbes and is a significant innovator in the sense that the question of law, legality, finds in Locke, I think, a resonance which is unmatched during his times or even among later philosophers. Now, to understand the role of sort of law or the civil magistrate, as we had left it there, let us begin by emphasizing the major registers of Lockean thinking. As we had noted, the state of nature was a state of perfect freedom, peace and goodwill for Locke. But in order for self-preservation of persons to prosper and to have a flight, right, you have to have a contract. And this is where he is similar. He is in fact, he does what Hobbes had done, but he does it very differently. Life, liberty, property. In order to protect these three registers, you have to have a contract. Now, what it is to, sort of understand the role of legality, the role of law in trying to protect life, liberty and property. Now, this is very significant in Locke because here he is emphasizing the role of civil law, which is very different from the role or freedom of conscience which individuals as persons tend to have. These laws are laws with penalty. I mean, if you violate somebody, right? If you commit stealing, if you commit a theft, if you steal, if you kill somebody, you'll be penalized, you'll be punished. This notion of law in all its regularities and details is somewhat missing in Hobbes. Now, to understand laws with penalty is important in Locke because, as you might find, that Locke often disapproves, and he's said to have been famous for that reason, that he disapproves the divine right of kings or rulers or sovereigns. I am your ruler, I am the sovereign, I have the dominion over your life and property because I've been elected by God. This is a notion rejected by Locke. He also not only rejects the divine right theory of sovereigns, kings or rulers, he also rejects paternal power. What is paternal power? And Locke goes in tremendous details to elaborate upon this paternal power, which is also very unique when we consider Locke, because this is not found in rigorous details everywhere. A father is there and he has his children. Now the children, because of their age and what Locke says, minority status, they are minors. One might wonder whether the later notion of minority derives from this Lockean, metaphor of father and children, paternal, familial, conjugal metaphor. Whether it derives from that is something to wonder. Fine. But the father has some control over the future and the present of his children. Now, the question of the mother has been emphasized by feminists, but it comes in Locke in a very different manner, and that's a topic of a different discussion. But let us stick to what Locke is saying. Now, the father looks after his children, right? He has some control, right? But this is where Locke makes a very important and elevating point. He says That doesn't mean that the father can, construct laws and provide the children with penalties. It's not that the father can be the legislator of the family. Okay? The family will be put under the father's control, and all households in the sort of society will be controlled by each father in each domestic household. This is not going to happen. There is a common municipal law, which Locke says, common municipal civil law, which will be paramount. The father himself will be subjected to those laws. So he rejects the paternal power, the divine right theory, and goes for a rational, right, very reasonable civil law administered by the civil magistrate. Now, these laws with penalty, as we see, ultimately provide the citizen with the preservation of life and property. Now he is successful in doing so. Mark one thing. The point is, Hobbes was never into these specific details where Locke actually harps and tries to hold on to them in a very, selfish, but in a very creative and original manner. Having understood the limits of paternal or divine right theory of power, the social contract is of course there. As we said, it follows, derivatively follows from what we have discussed. Even though state of nature is of a state of peace and goodwill, still, in order to preserve property and life, we have to have a social contract. Mark again that this notion of property is coming again and again, will appear again and again in Locke. And it is significant in Locke and very different from Hobbes and other predecessors. Now, having understood this, what is the particular form of, mechanism, the significant device by which Locke tries to unravel and unfold his thinking? In fact, he makes a clear distinction between two forms of government, in a sense. Democracy, obviously, he chooses as the best. Okay? There could be monarchy and everything like that. Fine. But within the form of government, he appears onto a discussion of legislature, legislator, and executive. The question of civil law that we were, trying to sort of explicate is the matter of legislature. And this meaning has prevailed in the later centuries, and the way we understand legislature today is of course given and offered by Locke. Legislature will discover and formulate, articulate the laws of nature. What does that mean? The laws of nature, as found by reason, are basically, natural laws which are given, which could be a matter of common sense, but which could be derived from the existing state of things. For instance, you shouldn't kill anybody. You shouldn't steal, right? One who has given his own labor and appropriates a particular fruit of nature, that is his own. That is his private right. That is his property. The executive will execute, will sort of instrumentalize, make these laws happen. Okay? Now, having demarcated forms of government and the kind of rigorous departments of the governmental existence, legislature, executive, Locke tries to go into much more detail. What is that? According to Locke, the legislature, that which discovers and articulates laws of nature, they are the supreme authority. The executive derives its authority from legislature. These laws have to be natural laws, in a sense, at par with nature. These laws have to be coherent. These laws have to be reasonable. I mean, I cannot have an unreasonable law or that which is incoherent. I mean, discontinuous. I cannot have a law which is something here and something there. right? If I devise a law that, well, men will, get this, and women, they are, household slaves. I cannot, because men are equal in nature. So deriving law from nature itself will ask you not to devise such a law. This is the Lockean, trajectory, the way he moves forward. I mean, you pick up any law, you can, if you try to think it, if you try to crack your brains as to, how the natural or the given, state of things stand, you could make an interpretation as to whether it is correct or not. For instance, if there is a dispute, a conflict. Now, all parties in that conflict will be heard. Everybody will be given a chance to speak up their mind, to speak up their position. Okay? This is called a principle of natural justice. According to law, this is natural justice because that everybody should be heard, and everybody should be allowed to elaborate on their positions is something which is derived from nature. Why? Because all are equal in nature. Natural law is basically distinguished from what you call positive law. These laws which we can derive from nature, principles of natural justice, natural reasoning, etc., life, liberty. Positive law is basically that which is derived and also sort of articulated, elaborated on, and instrumentalized, mechanized by men. If it's a man-made stuff, it is a positive law. If it's made by and out of nature, it is natural law. This departs from divine law, which we used to say previously, that this law is valid because it's derived from a divine command, from God. Locke is not saying this. Instead of God, he is trying to, preserve, protect, and institute nature in its place. In my lecture on Hobbes, I had told you that Hobbes is never, you could read into them with a lot of synthetic energy that Hobbes was a liberal thinker. He was a man who talked of, individuals and private rights and life and liberty. Not necessarily so. But Locke is precisely a liberal thinker. He is talking of individual rights. When he talks about property, he's talking about, individual property, individual person's property. Later, which will have, backed up by details and named as private property. And Marx will go into meticulous details to, attack private property. Now, after, Locke goes on to this kind of rejecting absolute private property through social contract, all kinds of stuff. Typologies of marking out typologies of government, democracy and monarchy and all kinds of stuff. He's obviously in favor of, a government by consent. And democracy is his choicest mode. But while trying to, work out the details of this government, as I told you, this is what Locke precisely stands for. He's trying to work out some details which was missing in Hobbes. He talks about, property. Can you take away property? No. Can the government take away property? Can the legislature take away property? And the question of taking away property is a sensitive issue for Locke. But he does that when he says that it could be possible with participatory consent. I participate in the process and I consent to that process. Then it's possible. And there is the question of taxation. He says that taxation, so far as taxation is concerned and its corresponding relief, then with the consent of the majority, taxes could be levied. Now, if you consider our times, nobody would agree to give tax. So if you go with the consent of the majority of the people, then the majority of people will not allow themselves to submit tax. So today it has assumed a form in which taxes are automatically levied for public services or whatever. And the consent today is never renewed. I mean, it is assumed the moment you have a government, you have participated in electing it, you have already consented to the procedures by which you will be governed. And taxes for public works or public services is one of those mechanisms. Now, so far as legislation is concerned, I mean, as you know, I mean, we have clearly sort of come to know that legislature is the most important for Locke, because they articulate the laws, they sort of mechanize, they sort of discover and sort of categorize these laws, they inscribe them. And the executive obviously, tries to implement those laws. But what are the limits of this legislative authority? Firstly, I mean, Locke is categorical in this. He says that the legislative activity should not be arbitrary or incoherent. According to Locke, the legislative activity should not be arbitrary, should be fixed, whose meanings should be absolutely grounded. These laws should be established laws promulgated by the legislative authority, legislature, and these laws will be for the good of the people. This is very significant because the good of the people is a term which appears with a renewed vigor in Locke. I mean, in no other thinkers in the 17th or the 16th century, the good of the people comes with this force, because here it is not an empty, high-sounding jargon, but good of the people is sort of, Locke tries to orchestrate the good of the people in terms of these departments, these works, these rules and these norms. But what is the last important point while, Locke is discussing legislature is that this legislative power, cannot be transferred. This legislative power cannot be transferred. I mean, legislature cannot say, now you pick up, my work and we shall not pursue this matter anymore. They cannot say this. This non-transference of particular designated authority is the paramount symptom and, signifier of modern governmental authority. I mean, the judiciary today cannot say that its functions are transferable. The political functions are not transferable to some other. This is what is known as a separation of powers. What is those last words on the executive by Locke? Firstly, of course, the executive is distinct from the legislature. The legislature will make laws, the executive will execute these laws. That is fine. But the significant part in terms of coordination and subordination of these departments of governmental existence is important in Locke. He says the executive is subordinate to the legislature. So it will work under the legislature. Okay? And it will derive authority from the legislature. What does that mean? Today, the legislature is basically people who are selected by the people. Authoritative representatives selected by the people, they generally form the assembly. Okay? These representatives make the laws. So, by default, what Locke is arguing, that the executive or the representatives of the governmental authority, they are subordinate to the legislature and derive their authority from the legislature. Today, it comes to mean that the representatives, the people's representatives, are subordinate to the people and they are answerable to the people. Their authority is, dependent on the people who actually represent, through a particular form of allocation and mechanism, elections and everything, their representatives. Now, it's of course a different topic and different tragedy that those who are represented today, they are not accountable to the people at all. They are doing their own stuff and people are suffering and they are in their own natural state. And that's a different discussion, different trajectory, why this happened and why is it a point, is it a disease that is symptomatic of all liberal thinking? I mean, what is the solution in Locke or Hobbes? I mean, if we say, in India this is very significant, because people, theoretically it's fine that, representatives, they are sort of answerable to the people, they are subordinate to the people, but the moment they represent it, they are sort of, doing their own stuff. They are pursuing their own agenda, making, accumulating riches and betraying all the promises. And on this, actually, that Hobbes, and later even from Hobbes to, Marx, of those traditions, the fascist and the communist traditions, there was an intense reaction to this kind of, this failure of the liberal project. Because, and the extreme reactions were fascist, the Nazi and the communist reactions, right? These separation of powers were not there. I had emphasized this in my previous lecture. It was a unity. It was absolute. And the moment, because it was thought, one might say that even in absolute governments, people are rejected. There's no question, people only obey. Now, the distinction is not made between the government and the people. If there's a king, the king is, one with the people, sort of. Absolute despot. The despot is absolute one with the people. The sovereign, one sovereign. There's a complete unity. There's no division of executive, legislature, and whatever. So once the unity is there, you cannot talk about that there is a failure by which the people are betrayed. Now, finally, Locke talks about the dissolution of, government. How does that happen? Now, the dissolution of government can happen, according to Locke, through external means. I mean, there could be aggression from foreign forces. The government could be dissolved through internal means. Now, this is very significant in India. For instance, we have emergency being declared, which could be declared when there is an armed rebellion inside. But Locke is making, when it talks about external means, even Indian constitution is, in agreement with Locke, there could be foreign aggression. But internal means, where Indian constitution, liberal democratic constitution apparently, talks about internal rebellion, Locke says something different. He says when legislation is, altered, broken or dissolved, or when the legislature is acting against public trust, or where there could be sort of rebellion also. I mean, then the government could be dissolved. He talks about rebellion and makes a significant point in the sense that rebellion could be justified and could be unjustified. And both justification of rebellion and the, dissolution of the justification could be in terms of, natural law. When a government, when an oppressive government transgresses all thresholds of natural law, I mean, one becomes, it crosses all levels of toleration, then a government could be, absolutely dissolved. Then there could be rebellion. So, but this rebellion has to be justified in terms of natural law. Whether the threshold of the level of toleration is still within limits, then the rebellion is not justified. But where the rebellion is made up, concocted, and the threshold of toleration is pushed beyond its natural limits, then the rebellion is unjustified. Okay? In the next lecture, so we shall unpack, raise certain suspicions on Locke and meditate a bit more on the question of religious toleration and how it is significant in our day. Thank you.